They said Cord Halloran bought himself a wife. That's the story Harland's Creek told for years, over back fences and breakfast tables, over whiskey glasses in the dim back corner of Arlo's saloon, where the lamplight was too low to read a man's expression properly, and the conversation ran accordingly. A mountain man came down off the ridge with a mule and a fistful of cash, paid off a gambling debt that had been rotting for 3 years, and walked away with a girl young enough to be his daughter. They said, she cried the whole way up the mountain. They said, she never came back down. Half of that is wrong, and the half that's right, they got the meaning completely backwards. Now, I want you to understand something before we go any further. Everything I'm about to tell you, the town already had a version of it. They told it at dinner tables and over back fences and in church pews on Sunday mornings. And their version wasn't wrong, exactly. It just didn't have the right beginning. And a story without the right beginning is just a rumor wearing a story's clothes. So let me give you the right beginning. Harland's Creek sat in a shallow valley between two ridge lines, the kind of town that looked permanent from a distance and provisional up close. The main street was mud in spring, dust in summer, mud again in fall, and frozen solid from November through March. The buildings leaned into each other like old men who had forgotten how to stand straight on their own. There was a general store run by a woman named Helen Patterson, who knew every item of inventory by heart and every piece of town gossip within 24 hours of it happening. There was a church where Pastor Green delivered sermons with the conviction of a man who believed in God, but was less certain about the people God had placed in his congregation. There was Arlo's saloon, which technically closed on Sundays, but practically didn't. And there were houses, maybe 60 of them, arranged along 4 cross streets, with the kind of careful spacing that suggested the original settlers had been optimistic about privacy. The people of Harland's Creek were not bad people. That's important to say, and I mean it. Most of them worked hard. Most of them loved their families. Most of them would help a neighbor through a hard winter without being asked twice. But they were a small town, and small towns have a particular talent for deciding what something means before they've finished watching it happen. They had decided about Cord Halloran years before the autumn of 1887. He came down off the mountain 4 times a year, give or take. He came with pelts and dried meat, and sometimes with ore samples from the high country that the mining company in Bitterfield would pay decent money to assess. He traded at Patterson's store, said what was necessary to complete his transactions, and left. He didn't drink with the men at Arlo's. He didn't court the women. He didn't attend church or town meetings or the twice-yearly community socials where everyone pretended to like everyone else for 4 hours. Nobody knew exactly where he lived. Only that it was high. Only that it was far. Only that the trail to his place branched off the main mountain road somewhere past the second ridge, and nobody from town had ever been invited to follow it. He was tall, 6 feet and change of lean, sun-dark muscle, with hands that were scarred from rope and knife and years of doing things the hard way. He had dark hair, going gray at the temples, and eyes the color of winter ice, pale and flat, and difficult to read. He'd been coming to town for 15 years. In 15 years, nobody had learned much about him beyond what those eyes didn't give away. They called him a mountain man, which was technically accurate and practically meant, we don't know what to do with this person, so we've put him in a category that explains why we don't have to try. He was 38 years old. He'd been alone on that mountain for 12 of those years, and in the autumn of 1887, for reasons that would take the better part of this story to explain properly, he came down to Harland's Creek on a Tuesday. and made a decision that changed two lives so completely that neither of them ever fully came back to what they'd been before. One of those lives was his. The other belonged to a girl named Elora Wren. The girl and the dead Elora was 19 years old, and she had done nothing wrong in her entire life. That's not a figure of speech. I mean it as a precise statement of fact. She had not gambled. She had not drunk. She had not made poor decisions with money or people or the small amount of future she'd been given to work with. She had spent the last 3 years of her life doing what needed doing, keeping a house that wanted to fall apart, managing a budget that didn't balance, no matter how carefully she managed it, and watching her father make the same mistakes in slightly different configurations with the same reliable outcome. Her father's name was Jacob Voss. He was not a cruel man. That's also precise. He was something harder to forgive than cruel. He was a weak man who had learned somewhere along the way that if he was charming enough about his failures, other people would manage the consequences for him. He had been doing it for years. He had done it to Elora's mother, Eleanor, who had spent a decade being quietly competent, while Jacob was loudly optimistic until the optimism ran out and the money ran out and Eleanor's health ran out shortly after. Eleanor Wren had died 3 years before the autumn of 1887. Fever, the doctor said. But Elora knew the real accounting. She had watched her mother grow thinner and slower over the course of a year, while Jacob gambled away 3 separate chances to buy the medicine that might have helped. By the time Eleanor died, she and Elora had both understood for months that she was going to. They had had enough time to say what needed saying, and Eleanor had said one thing in particular on a quiet evening 6 weeks before the end. She said it looking at Elora in the mirror, her hand still moving the brush through her hair with the slow deliberateness of someone conserving effort, a woman who had been beautiful and capable, and who had been made smaller by a life that hadn't known what to do with either quality. Don't let them make you small, baby. Promise me, Elora had promised. She was 16 at the time, and she didn't fully understand what the promise meant. She understood it better now. She just wasn't certain she had managed to keep it. Jacob Voss had been running a debt with the Cattlemen's Bank of Harland's Creek for 3 years. It had started at $800, a loan to cover a bad cattle season, which Jacob had intended to repay and had not. Interest had a way of being patient in ways that Jacob was not, and by September of 1887, the number on the bank's ledger next to the name Voss, Jacob E., was $2,100. The bank president, a colorless man named Arthur Lewis, had given Jacob his final notice in August. Pay by the 1st of October, or the property goes to settlement. Jacob did not have $2,100. Jacob did not have $21. Jacob had a daughter, a deteriorating house on the edge of town, and a talent for seeing opportunity in situations that other men would have recognized as disasters. He had gone to Cord Halloran the first time in July. Cord had listened and said no without elaboration. Jacob went back in August with a revised proposal. Cord said no again. The third time in mid-September, Jacob came with something different, something he had been reluctant to bring but had run out of alternatives for. Cord listened to the full proposal. He did not say yes immediately. He said, "I'd need to ask the girl first." Jacob said he had already asked her, and that she had agreed. Cord looked at the Jobos for a long moment, long enough that Jacob shifted his weight and studied his boots with great attention. Then Cord said he would think on it, and he went back up the mountain. He came back down 4 days later with enough cash to clear the bank debt. What Cord didn't know, what he wouldn't fully understand until later, was that Jacob Voss had not asked his daughter. Not really. He had told her what was going to happen, and when she had gone pale and absolutely still, He had interpreted her silence as agreement because that was the interpretation he needed. And Elora, standing in her narrow bedroom, with flour still white on her hands from the bread she had been making, had understood in the space of 30 seconds that there was no exit that didn't cost more than she had. So she had not said yes, but she had not said no. And, in the economy of Jacob Voss's conscience, those two things were the same. The morning of the wedding. Her father disappeared the morning of the wedding. She had known he would. Jacob Voss was a man who could arrange things and then find urgent business elsewhere when those arrangements arrived at their moment of consequence. She had watched him do it her entire life. The sudden memory of an errand, the convenient headache, the vague and unverifiable obligation that materialized precisely when the bill for his decisions came due. She didn't waste time being angry about it. She had learned years ago that anger at her father was a fire that burned only her. She dressed alone. The wedding dress was white, which struck her as the wrong color for the occasion, but there was nothing to be done about it. Her mother's dress altered to fit. Eleanor had been taller, and the hem had needed taking up, and Elora had done the work herself 2 evenings before with the small precise stitches her mother had taught her. She did her hair with the comb her mother had left her. She looked in the mirror for one moment and then looked away. She walked to the church alone. The morning was the particular cold of early October in mountain country, sharp and clear, with a sky so blue it looked wrong, too vivid, like someone had oversaturated the world while she wasn't looking. Her breath made small ghosts in the air ahead of her. The town's main street was quiet. At this hour, the shops not yet open, the houses still private behind their curtained windows. But by the time she reached the church, they were all there. Every pew was full. The whole town had come out, which surprised her and also didn't. This was the kind of event that Harland's Creek arranged itself around, not to celebrate exactly, but to witness. To have been there, to be able to say, later, with all the complicated satisfaction that phrase contains, I was in that church. I saw it happen. She stood in the doorway for one moment and looked at all of them. Mrs. Calloway was whispering behind her fan to the woman beside her, and Elora didn't need to hear the words to know their shape. The Miller brothers, 3 of them, all oversized and underthoughtful, were already snickering in the second-to-last pew. Even Pastor Green, standing at the front with his Bible, held slightly away from his body like a shield, looked like a man performing a duty he hadn't signed up for and couldn't find a way to decline. She squared her shoulders. She walked down the aisle alone. She kept her eyes forward and her spine straight, and she counted the faces as she passed, not looking for sympathy, not expecting any, just counting in the way that a person counts steps on a difficult climb, one at a time. Keep moving. Don't stop. At the altar stood Cord Halloran. She'd seen him in town before, 3 or 4 times over the years, always briefly, always at a distance sufficient to make the up-close version. A minor surprise, he was taller than she had recalled. The dark hair was slicked back, still so slightly damp. He had washed it recently, which was a detail she registered without knowing what to do with. He had shaved, but there was a small cut on his jaw where the razor had caught. The kind of cut a man gets when he is going too fast or thinking about something else entirely. His shirt was clean. It was probably his only clean shirt. His hands hung at his sides with no particular purpose, and he was looking somewhere past the altar rather than at her, his jaw set and his expression the careful blankness of a man who is not going to give the room anything more than it's already getting. He looked, she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, as miserable as she felt, not angry, not impatient, not the expression of a man who has paid for something and expects delivery on schedule, just a man who had made a decision. he was no longer entirely certain about. Standing in a room full of people who had already decided what it meant. Looking like he would rather be almost anywhere else on earth. She found, inexplicably, that this made her feel marginally better. "The ceremony, dearly beloved," Pastor Green began, in a voice that had misplaced its conviction sometime around the previous Christmas, and had not yet found it again. Alora barely heard the words. Her mind was doing what minds do in impossible situations, running calculations, looking for exits, trying to find the angle that changed the arithmetic into something survivable. The bank held the papers. Cord had paid the debt. Her father had made his promises and then made himself absent. The legal machinery had already turned. There was no angle. There was only through, do you, Cord Halloran. Take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was rough, not unkind. Just rough. The voice of a man who didn't use it much and hadn't thought to prepare it for the occasion. 2 words, offered and done, no embellishment. And do you, Alora Wren, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched. It was not a long silencing clock. Probably 5 seconds, probably fewer. But it was the kind of silence that fills a room completely, that takes up all the available air, that makes every person in a crowded space suddenly and uncomfortably aware of their own breathing. Someone in the back coughed. Pastor Green's eyebrows rose a careful 1/4 inch. And Cord Halloran, for the first time since she had walked through those doors, looked directly at her. His expression was unreadable. Not angry, not impatient, not the expression of man who has been waiting and is done waiting. He was simply looking at her. Waiting in the way that she would later come to understand was characteristic of him, as if he had all the time available and would stand there as long as she needed without making a production of it. What choice did she have? I do, she said, a whisper, but it carried. Then by the power vested in me, Pastor Green said with audible relief, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride. Cord's jaw tightened. She saw it. The small contraction of muscle, the fractional change in his expression. He stepped forward, and her whole body went rigid in the involuntary way of a person bracing for impact. Every muscle she had was ready for something. She didn't know exactly what. She just knew she was braced against it. He didn't grab her. He didn't claim anything. He leaned down, slowly, giving her enough time to track what he was doing, and pressed the briefest, most impersonal kiss to her forehead. The kind you would give a child. The kind you would give a relative you hadn't seen in years and weren't sure how to greet. Lips barely touching skin, and then withdrawing, before the contact had time to be anything. Then he stepped back. It's done, he said. He said it to Pastor Green, not to her, the way a man announces the completion of a task to the person who assigned it. Flat and final, and already moving on, the church exhaled. She could feel it, the collective release of a room that had been holding its breath waiting for a spectacle, and had been given something too small and too strange to fully categorize. She stood at the altar in her dead mother's dress and thought, I am married. The thought had no particular texture. It was just infusion, sitting there without anywhere to go, the leaving outside. A wagon waited, not a wedding carriage. There was nothing ceremonial about it in any direction. A working ranch wagon with a patched canvas cover and 2 sturdy horses that had clearly been more places than their driver had bothered to describe. What practical and plain and utterly indifferent to the occasion. It suited him, she thought. Everything about Cord Halloran was practical and plain and indifferent to occasions. She looked at it, standing in the dirt road in the morning sun, and heard herself say, before she could stop it, This is it? Cord paused with one hand on the wagon's side panel. He turned and looked at her without hostility, without impatience, with the same unreadable steadiness he had brought to the entire morning. "Were you expecting something else?" "I don't know what I was expecting." He nodded. Slowly, once, the way a person nods when they have heard something that makes sense to them. Like, not knowing what you were expecting, in this particular situation, was the most logical position a person could reasonably take. Then he held out his hand. She looked at it. She turned away from it and grabbed the wheel spoke and pulled herself up onto the bench. Her dress caught on the hub, and she had to work it loose with two sharp yanks that accomplished nothing elegant, and by the time she was settled on the wooden bench, her face was hot and her hands were shaking slightly, and she was furious with herself for both of those things. Cord walked around to the other side without comment. He climbed up. He took the reins. The town watched them leave. She felt their stares the whole length of Main Street, on her back and her shoulders, and the branding her with the story they had already finished writing. She didn't turn around. She wouldn't give them that. She kept her eyes on the road ahead and let the town fall away behind her. And she thought about her mother's voice. "Don't let them make you small." She thought about how much smaller she felt right now than she had on the worst days of the last 3 years. And she wasn't sure yet what to do with that information. They rode in silence for a long time. The road out of Harland's Creek climbed steadily north into the foothills, leaving behind the dust and the judgment and the particular quality of air that settles over a small town like a second ceiling pressed down from above. Pine trees crowded close on both sides of the road. The sky opened and closed between the branches in shifting irregular pieces. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of the horses, and occasionally the wind moving through the upper branches in a way that was almost a voice and not quite. She watched him from the edge of her vision, the way he held the reins. Loose and easy. Not gripping. Not fighting the horses, just holding a conversation with them through the leather. The way his eyes moved steadily along the tree line and the road ahead, taking in information. The way a person reads, constantly and without urgency, he read the landscape. She could see him doing it. The way a shadow fell across the road. The way a branch had been recently broken on a pine 40 yards ahead. He noted it and moved on. "How far is it?" she finally asked. "Another hour. Do you come to town often?" No, that was it. Just no. Not no, but I will if you need it. Not no, but that can change. Just a flat, geographical fact, complete and closed. She swallowed the dozen other questions burning in her throat and looked at the road instead. What kind of life was waiting for her? What did he expect from her? What would happen tonight when the sun went down and they were alone in whatever place they were riding toward, with no neighbors and no witnesses and no one who would know? Her stomach felt like cold water. "I should tell you something," Cord said suddenly. She tensed all over. "What? The house isn't fancy. It's clean. Small? 3 rooms. I wasn't." He stopped. "I didn't prepare for company." "I'm not company," she said. "I'm your wife." He flinched. She saw it, a small tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in the set of his jaw. Like the word had landed somewhere it hadn't expected to land. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess you are." They rode, in silence after that, and the road kept climbing, and the town kept falling away behind them. And she tried not to count the miles between herself and anything familiar, the trail. After another half hour, the wagon road ended. It simply stopped at a wide flat rock outcropping, where the terrain changed its mind about what it was willing to permit. The trail beyond was narrow, horse width, no more. Cord set the brake and got down without explanation. 2 horses were tied and waiting at the tree line. He must have left them here on his way down to town that morning, she realized. He had thought this through. He had planned the logistics of bringing her home before she existed in this situation. As a person, he needed to bring anywhere. She watched him transfer her small trunk from the wagon to the pack animal. He worked with the same efficient economy she had been watching since the church. No wasted motion, no unnecessary effort, the precise application of knowledge to task. He was very good at the physical world. She could see that clearly. Whatever else he was or wasn't, the physical world cooperated with him in a way it didn't cooperate with most people. He brought a third horse to where she stood. She looked at it. She had ridden before, but not much, and not in a dress, and not on a mountain trail she had never seen. She reached for the saddle horn and pulled herself up with more determination than grace, and when she finally found her seat, the horse stood politely still, as if it had assessed the situation and decided cooperation was the appropriate response. Cord mounted. He pointed up the trail. He started moving. She followed. For 3 hours they climbed through forest so dense that the sky came down to them in pieces, blue fragments between the branches, shifting and rearranging as the wind moved through the crowns. The air changed with altitude in a way she could feel before she understood it. Got sharper, got colder, carried the smell of pine resin and wet granite, and something older underneath, something that predated human settlement and had never been persuaded to care about it. She was watching the trail directly in front of her horse when the horses ahead slowed. Cord stopped. She came around the bend and saw it. The cabin sat in a small, natural clearing on the upper slope, backed against a granite ridge that rose. Another 300 feet above the roof line, log walls squared and fitted with precision, the gaps chinked gray and tight. A stone chimney at the east end was breathing a thin thread of white smoke into the afternoon air, which meant he had banked a fire before leaving that morning, which meant he had planned for her arrival, even before she existed in this situation, as a person he needed to plan for. A covered porch, a lean-to barn, a wood pile stacked higher than her head and wider than her bedroom in town, a smokehouse the shape of a standing coffin, a kitchen garden plot, mostly winterized now, with the skeleton of a wire fence that had been losing its argument with time. Beyond all of it, ridge after ridge after ridge of mountain, going west, until they disappeared into the gray afternoon sky. No other structures visible. No roads. No smoke from any other chimney in any direction. She sat on the horse and understood, not in the way you understand something you've been told, but in the way you understand something your body has registered before your mind has caught up the distance from town, the nature of the terrain between here and any other human being, the specific arithmetic of isolation. If this man, this quiet, scarred, unreadable man she had married this morning, if he decided to do something she couldn't stop, there was no mechanism in this world that would know about it until the snow melted in spring. The cold in her chest had nothing to do with altitude. She dismounted. Her legs were unsteady. She put one hand on the horse's neck until she was certain she could stand without showing it. Cord led the horses to the lean-to and began unsaddling, checking hooves, measuring grain, the automatic prayer of a man for whom these actions had been the structure of his days for a very long time. He moved through it with the focused calm of a person who has no audience and needs no one. She stood in the yard with her trunk beside her and waited. He came back out and stopped a few feet away. Up close and in the mountain light, he was all the things she had noticed in town, and more. The height, the scarred hands, the jaw that looked cut from the same granite as the ridge behind the cabin, and a scar she hadn't seen before, a white line running from below his left ear to the corner of his mouth, old and smooth, long-healed. Whatever had made it had been serious. He looked at her, not the way a man looks at a woman he wants, more the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't quite solved, turning it over, trying to find the approach that makes sense. Then he said, "Cold front coming in tonight. Firewood's inside. I'll show you the water." That was her greeting. The lock the hand pump was on the north side of the cabin, iron, set into a stone basin, functional and permanent. "Freezes hard by December," he said. "After that we melt snow." "All right," she said. He looked at her once more. Then he walked inside. She followed him in. The main room was exactly what he had described on the wagon. Small, plain, clean. A stone hearth that took up most of the north wall, with a fire going low and steady. A work table with 2 chairs, open shelves, holding provisions in neat rows. A cast iron stove in the corner. 2 doors at the back of the room. A rope ladder going up to a loft above. She could see the edge of a straw mattress, a folded blanket, a hook on the rafter for hanging things. She looked at the 2 doors, looked at the loft, did the mental arithmetic of sleeping arrangements without asking, because she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. He pointed to the door on the left. "That one's yours," he said. She looked at it, then at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. The condition, the qualification, the thing that turned the simple statement into something she needed to be careful about. He reached into the pocket of his coat. He set something on the table between them, a small iron bolt, new, the metal still bright and clean, untouched by weather or use. She could see on the back of it the faint mark left when something has been made specifically to order rather than taken off a standard shelf. Someone had made this recently. Someone had asked for it. "I'll fit it to your door frame in the morning," he said. "You can bolt it from the inside." She stared at it. "You don't." "Don't," she started. "I've slept alone 15 years," he said. "I'm not looking to change that arrangement without consent." The word landed in the room like something with weight, consent. She turned it over. Not a word she had expected to hear tonight. Not from this man. In this place, on this mountain, at the end of this particular day. Not in 1887, in a one-room cabin, with the wind starting up outside. From a man the whole town had classified as barely better than wild. He was already turning back to the hearth, adjusting the fires back to her. His attention returned to the next item in the sequence of things that needed doing, as if he hadn't just said the most surprising thing anyone had said to her in years. "Are you hungry?" he asked. No, I don't think I could eat, all right. I'll make something anyway, in case." He reached for the pot. "Your room's got fresh sheets, a quilt, a lamp. There's a creek 50 yards behind the house, if you want to wash up. Privy's out back." He paused. "I'm not good at this, at talking, at any of this. But if you need something, tell me. I'll do my best." Then he went back to the pot, and she was standing in the middle of a strange house, married to a man she didn't know, with an iron bolt on the table in front of her. She picked it up. She held it in her hand for a long time. It was cold from his pocket. Almost nothing in terms of weight. And yet it had the particular gravity of an object that means more than its material form can account for. She thought about the fact that he had it ready, that he had gone somewhere to order this specific thing, and he had carried it down to Harland's Creek in his coat pocket, and he had brought it back up the mountain today. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. Before she had a chance to be afraid in front of him. He had known she would be afraid. He had not dismissed that fear. He had not argued with it. He had prepared for it, had handed her a tool for it, a physical object she could hold in her hand and operate without asking anyone's permission. She walked to her room and stood in the doorway, small, as promised, a bed with clean linen, a quilt at the foot, the kind made by a woman somewhere and traveled a long road to end up here, a lamp on the bedside table, wick trimmed, a hook on the wall for clothes, a window the size of a looking out at the dark slope of the mountain in the fading afternoon light. She set the iron bolt on the bedside table where she could see it. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Outside the room she could hear him moving. The fire, the pot, the soft, businesslike sounds of a man making himself useful in the only way he knew how. Without drama, without performance, without needing anyone to watch, she sat there for a long time, listening, and slowly, not all at once, not completely, not even close to completely. Something in her chest began to untighten. Not trust. Not yet. Not anything close to trust, but the beginning of the absence of the worst kind of fear. And in that particular situation, in that small room on the side of a mountain, at the end of the longest day of her life, the distance between those two things was everything. She lay down on the bed still in her wedding dress because she had nothing else to wear, and the thought of asking him for something felt like more than she had left in her for tonight. She closed her hand around the iron bolt. She listened to the wind beginning to move against the walls, pressing at the logs, looking for the way in that it wouldn't find. And outside the room, Cord Halloran made dinner for both of them in case she changed her mind, and did not test the door, and did not knock, and kept his word in the only way that mattered on a night like this one, which was, completely, and without needing to be thanked for it. The horse and the window dawn came to the mountain like it meant business. No gentle lightening of the sky, no soft gradation from dark to gray to pale gold, the way it happened down in the valley. Up here, one moment it was night, and the next moment the sun was clearing the eastern ridge and hitting everything at once. The frost on the cabin roof, the snow on the high peaks, the cleared ground of the yard, where the morning light made long shadows from every stone and stacked piece of wood. She had not slept, not truly. She had drifted in and out of something that resembled sleep, the way a shallow puddle resembles a river. Similar in kind, entirely different in substance, she had lain on the narrow bed in her wedding dress because she still had nothing else to wear. And she had listened to the cabin all night long. She had listened for his footsteps, for the creak of boards under approaching weight, for the sound of a hand on the door. She had held the iron bolt against her palm and kept her breathing shallow and waited for the thing she had been bracing against since the morning. Her father told her what was going to happen. The door had not opened, not once, not a test, not a check, not even the particular silence of a person standing close to a door and considering it. The cabin had given her only its honest sounds, the fire settling, the wind against the north wall, the distant creak of the lean-to in a gust, and eventually, somewhere in the small hours, she had accepted that this was all there was going to be. She got up before full light and went to the window. Cord was already in the lean-to. There was a young horse she hadn't noticed the night before, a roan, maybe 3 years old, still carrying the particular uncertainty of an animal that hasn't yet decided whether the world is a place it can trust. It kept shying away from him. Every time he took a step closer, the horse retreated to the far corner of the stall, ears flattened, showing the whites of its eyes, and Cord stopped. Every time the horse moved away, he simply stopped moving. He stood still with his hands loose at his sides, his weight back on his heels, everything about him communicating the same message in the same patient register. I am not chasing you. I am not pushing. I am here, and I will still be here when you decide you are ready, and there is no urgency about any of it. The horse edged sideways along the stall wall. Cord waited. The horse snorted, shook its head, stamped once. Cord waited. A full minute passed. She counted the seconds without meaning to. Then the horse took one step forward. Just one. A small, tentative, testing step, like a word said quietly to see if the room was safe for it. Cord did not move toward it. He let the horse make the full distance on its own terms, until the animal's nose was against his shoulder, and he could raise one hand slowly and lay it along the horse's jaw. Elora stood at the window with her breath fogging the glass. She was watching something she didn't yet have the words for. She could feel it, the weight of what she was seeing, but the language for it hadn't arrived yet. It would come later, over the course of weeks and months, assembling itself from accumulated evidence. For now, she just stood and watched a man and a frightened horse on a cold mountain morning, and felt something very quietly begin to shift in the part of her that had been braced and locked and waiting since the wedding. She was at the window for longer than she realized. When she finally turned away, the morning had arrived fully, and the coffee in the pot on the stove was already hot. He had made it before going out to the horses. She stood in the empty main room and looked at the pot for a long moment. Then she poured herself a cup, and she sat down at the table, and she thought about what it meant that a man who barely knew her had made coffee in the dark before dawn on the morning, after she'd spent the night in his house afraid of him. She didn't have an answer, but she held the cup with both hands and let the warmth come through, and she thought it might be worth finding out. The first morning she came out of her room, mid-morning still in the wedding dress, because she still had nothing else, and her hair was a wreck, and she had done what she could with it, using only her fingers and the small comb from her coat pocket, which was not much. Cord was at the stove. Bacon and eggs, and the smell of both came at her with a force she hadn't anticipated. She had not eaten since the previous morning, and her body had decided to make this known loudly and without diplomacy. He glanced up when she appeared. "Morning, morning. Coffee's hot. Food's almost ready." He turned back to the skillet. A pause in which he appeared to be considering something. "You need clothes. I can ride to town tomorrow. See what Mrs. Patterson has. I don't have money. I do. I can't keep." "You need clothes, Elora." His voice was patient and flat, the voice of someone stating a fact that is not improved by debate. That's not negotiable, she wanted to argue. The instinct was there, to push back, to make clear she was not going to owe him anything she didn't have to owe, to establish from the beginning of this thing whatever territory she still had that was hers. But he was right. She was standing in a ruined wedding gown at 10 in the morning on a mountain in October, and some arguments weren't worth the cost of having them. "Thank you," she said stiffly. He nodded and put bacon on a plate and set it at her place at the table without ceremony. They ate in silence. The food was plain: bacon, eggs, biscuits that were slightly burnt on the bottom, but entirely edible. He ate quickly, and without apparent opinion about any of it, in the way of a man who has been feeding himself alone, long enough that food has become fuel and nothing more, and has lost whatever additional significance it once held. She looked at her plate, then at him. "What do you do?" "Here," she said. "All day, I mean." He thought about it, genuinely considered the question, as if the answer required accuracy. "Ranch work. Tend the horses, fix things that break, hunting when we need meat, firewood for winter, trapline, through the high timber in season." He shrugged, the smallest possible movement of his shoulders. "It's a lot of work for one person." She heard the thing underneath the statement. She heard it clearly, and she said what she hadn't planned on saying until it was already out. "Two people now." He looked up. Surprise moved across his face. Not a large or dramatic thing, just a small recalibration around his eyes, there, and gone in under a second. "You don't have to," he said. "I'm not going to sit around doing nothing." "I can work? You ever worked a ranch before?" "No." "No, but I can learn." He looked at her with that measuring quality she was starting to recognize, present and unhurried, not unkind, the look of someone deciding something based on evidence rather than assumption. Then he said, "All right, finish eating." After breakfast, she went back to her room and changed into the plain work dress from her trunk, the one that had survived 3 years of actual use and was made, unlike the wedding gown, for the world as it actually was. When she came back out, Cord was already outside. She followed him out and started helping, without asking. He adjusted his position to account for her presence, the way water adjusts around a new stone, making room without announcement, redistributing without fuss. They worked the young roan together for the better part of an hour, and the animal that had been shying and uncertain, that morning stood still for brushing. By the time they were done, Cord handed her the brush without explanation. She took it and went to work on the horse's near shoulder. He leaned against the fence and watched. She could feel his attention without looking at it. Then, firm strokes. She can't feel light ones. Through the winter coat. She, Alora said, her name's Scout, came to me 3 months ago from a man in Bitterfield who didn't know what he had. A pause that had nothing restless in it. She knows more than she's showing you. Give her time. Alora kept brushing. That seems to be your solution for most things, she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, quietly, it's worked so far. The land he rode to town the following day and came back with 2 plain work dresses, a heavy canvas jacket, and a pair of boots that fit well enough. He had guessed her sizes correctly, which she noted without comment. She put on the jacket that evening to help him bank the fire in the smokehouse. And when she came back inside, smelling of wood smoke and cold pine air, she felt, for the first time since the morning of the wedding, like herself, rather than a prop in someone else's story. After breakfast on the 3rd day, he took her around the full property. It was not a tour in any social sense. He did not narrate extensively or perform enthusiasm for things that didn't merit it. He walked and pointed and named and moved on, trusting her to keep up and to ask if she didn't understand something. She kept up. She asked 3 questions, all specific, and he answered each one with the same precise economy he brought to everything else. The barn held 6 horses, 4 working animals and Scout, and 1 old gelding, who had been retired from trail work 2 seasons ago and now occupied a corner stall with the dignified calm of a creature that had earned its rest. The chicken coop was in poor condition, listing slightly to the south and missing half its roof covering. Let things slide, Cord said, looking at it without apology. When you're alone, you focus on what keeps you alive. The rest doesn't seem to matter. It matters now, she said. He looked at her. That small recalibration again, the one she was beginning to catalog. Yes, he said. It does. The kitchen garden had been winterized, but poorly. The fence was half collapsed. The beds unprotected, the soil compacted, and weed threaded in the sections she could see through the snow. There was a root cellar dug into the hillside, behind the cabin, well stocked and cold and organized with the particular precision of a man who understood. Winter on a mountain was not a metaphor. There was the spring-fed creek she had been told about, 50 yards behind the cabin, running clear and fast, under a thin skin of ice at its edges, reliable and cold. She stood at the creek for a moment and looked at the water moving under the ice. Does it ever freeze completely? She asked. Deep winter, sometimes. Not often. The spring keeps it running. What do you do when it does? Melt snow on the stove. Takes longer. He looked at the creek. Hasn't frozen solid in 3 years. Probably won't this year either. She filed this away with everything else. She had been filing things away since she arrived. Not consciously, not with any particular plan, but in the way of a person who has spent years living in a situation that required reading everything available and storing it against future need. The habit ran deep. The mountain was giving her a great deal to read. They worked until the light failed. Her hands blistered. Her back found new muscles she hadn't known it had, and introduced them to her with considerable insistence. The wedding dress, which she had been using as a work garment, Since there was no point trying to preserve it, was ruined past saving by the time they came in for the evening. She didn't mind, which is, she had helped him mend a section of fence in the afternoon, passing nails, holding boards, learning the sequence of it. And somewhere in the middle of that work, without anything dramatic happening to mark the moment, she had felt something unfamiliar move through her chest. It took her a while to identify it. Purpose. Just that. Not happiness, not relief, not anything as large as hope. Just the simple, specific feeling of a person doing something that needs doing with someone who accepts her help without comment and expects her to be competent and does not make a performance of it either way. She hadn't felt it in years. She ate dinner that night with an appetite she hadn't had since before the wedding. Small languages. A few days later, she found the ice grips on the table next to her breakfast plate. She had been falling on the packed ice path of the hand pump twice in 3 days, both times getting up before he could move toward her, both times carrying the specific heat of someone who has been clumsy in front of a person they are not yet comfortable being clumsy in front of. He had noticed. She had known he noticed. He had not said anything, which she recognized as exactly the right response. The ice grips were leather straps with iron cleats riveted to the soles, the kind worn over boots to keep a person upright on frozen ground. She picked one up and turned it over. She could see the tooling on the leather, the careful, even spacing of the rivets, the small reinforcement at the heel strap where extra wear would come. He had made these, not bought them, made them from material. He had in the barn at some point in the last few days when she hadn't been watching. He was at the stove with his back to her. She pulled them on over her boots without saying anything. He didn't turn around. She went out to the water pump and walked the whole length of the path without sliding once. She stood at the pump in the cold morning air and worked the handle and let the water fill the bucket. And she thought about what it means when a person solves a problem. You didn't ask them to solve without making you thank them for it or acknowledge that you needed help. She thought about it. For most of that day, the weeks began to find their shape. She learned to split wood properly, not the flailing she had been doing in the first days, but the real way, where weight and gravity and the grain of the wood did most of the work, and the axe was simply the instrument of a decision already made. She learned to keep the fire through the night, the right arrangement of logs and ash, to hold coals until morning. She learned to read the sky in the way he read it, the particular gray that meant snow inside 4 hours, the ring around the moon that meant hard freeze, the way the horses moved in the lean-to before a storm. He taught these things without teaching them, which is to say he did not lecture, and he did not instruct in any formal sense. He did what he did, and she watched. And when she tried it herself, he watched in turn, and if she was wrong, he showed her the correction once without comment, and if she was right, he moved on without comment. And the absence of comment for both outcomes was the clearest and most efficient teaching she had ever received. One evening, she came in from checking the smokehouse to find the roan's lead rope on her bedside table, placed there while she was outside. She had left it on the fence post that morning, and he had brought it in at some point without mentioning it. She put it in her coat pocket and wore it there for several days, and neither of them said a word about it. He fixed the chicken coop on a Tuesday without telling her he was going to. She rebuilt the garden fence on a Thursday, replacing the failed posts and restringing the wire in sections. And when he came to look at it that evening, he stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets, studying the work. "Good tension on the wire," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and walked to the barn. She stood by the fence for a moment after he had gone and thought about how much the 4 words had cost him and how much they had been worth. 6 days, 3 weeks, 3 after the wedding, the first real storm came. Not the cold front he had mentioned on their first night. That had been 2 days of hard wind and manageable snow. Nothing the cabin hadn't absorbed 100 times before. This was different. This was the mountain deciding to be serious about winter. The sky turned the color of old pewter by mid-afternoon. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. Cord came in from the barn, with snow already stacking on his coat, and said 4 words. We stay inside. They were inside for 6 days. Snow came sideways through the first night and half of the next day, stacking 4 feet against the door, covering the path to the barn completely, and then covering it again, each time he dug it out. The world beyond the windows became featureless white, moving and shifting and textured by wind, but without edges, without distance, without any of the geographical reference points she had been using to orient herself since she arrived. There was just the cabin and the white outside, and the 2 of them. The first day was awkward. The cabin was small. She had established this early and had adapted to it by learning the rhythms of occupying it in shifts, one coming in as the other went out, the demands of the mountain creating a natural circulation that kept them in proximity without requiring sustained contact. Now, the mountain's demands had been replaced by a single imperative: stay warm, keep the animals alive. Wait. She organized the provision shelves. She mended everything that needed mending and some things that didn't. He worked on trapline equipment at the table, moving through each mechanism with methodical patience, cleaning and resetting and testing, hands busy, attention inward. They were, she would understand later, both doing exactly the same thing, finding work for their hands, so that the enforced closeness didn't become a pressure that neither of them was equipped to manage. Yet, by the second day, it had stopped feeling close. By the third day, she wasn't certain what it was. He was not a man who filled silence with sound for the sake of it. He didn't hum or whistle or make any of the small unconscious noises that most people generate when they are not thinking about it. He was simply present, quiet and completely present, doing what he was doing, neither advancing into her space nor retreating from it, as naturally unobtrusive as furnitures that has been in a room long enough to belong to it. She found, to her own considerable surprise, that this was the easiest kind of company she had ever been in. On the evening of the third day, she asked him how long he had been on the mountain. He said 12 years, more or less, with a few weeks away. Here and there she asked if he got lonely. He said the word before she could say it herself, which told her he had thought about the question before it was asked. He said it the way he said most true things, flat and without defensiveness, as a fact rather than a confession. It gets quiet, real quiet. Especially in winter. He looked at the fire. I thought for a long time that quiet was what I wanted. Came up here to find it on purpose, and, she said, and quiet is fine until it isn't, until you start hearing things in it that you'd rather not. She understood that. She had lived with that kind of quiet in her father's house, the silence that fills a space where something used to be and doesn't know what else to do. What do you hear? She asked. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought the question had ended the conversation. Then he said, my sister, just that, 2 words, placed in the air between them and left there, and then he picked up the trap mechanism he had been working on and went back to it, and she let the 2 words sit where he had put them, because she had already learned enough about Cord Harlland to know that following him into something he wasn't ready to say was as useful as pushing that roan horse before it was ready to go. On the 6th day the wind dropped. All at once, like a hand lifted, the snow stopped. The sky cleared to a blue that was almost painful. After 6 days of nothing but white, he dug them out in 3 hours. She helped for 2 of them. That evening, the cabin had the particular quality of a room after the windows have been opened and the old air replaced. The same space, but different in it. She was at the fire with tea when he came in from the last check of the animals. He sat down across from her. He looked at his hands. And then he told her something she hadn't been expecting. What he knew. "Your father told me you had agreed," Cord said. She looked at him over her cup to the arrangement. "Before I came down to town, he told me he had asked you and you had agreed." She was very still. "I told him I needed to ask you directly. That was my condition." He was looking at his hands, hence, not at her. He said, "There wasn't time. The bank deadline was firm." He said you had already told him. "Yes." "He didn't ask me," she said. "I know." "Then how?" "I didn't know then." "Not for certain." He looked up. "But I had a feeling. The kind you get when a man is telling you what you want to hear, instead of what is true. I should have gone to you directly, regardless." "I didn't." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry." For my part in it, the fire made its small sounds. Outside, the cleared sky was brilliant with cold stars. She sat with the apology and tested it the way you test ice, listening for the sounds that tell you whether it will hold or crack. She had heard enough hollow apologies in her life to know the difference in the sound of them. This did not sound hollow. This sounded like a man who had been carrying something and had decided the carrying was less useful than the setting. Down. "If you had come to me directly," she said slowly, "before the wedding, if you had asked me what I actually wanted—" "You would have said no," he said. Not an accusation, just a fact he had clearly turned over many times in his own time. "I would have said no," she agreed. "Yes?" He looked back at the fire. "That's what I thought." The silence between them changed quality, became more substantial. The kind of silence that settles into a room after some true has been said in it. "Why did you go through with it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because your father was desperate, and because He stopped. "I've been alone a long time, Alora. I thought I had everything I needed, the land, the work. I convinced myself the quiet was what I had come for." His hands were still on the table. "But I had been lying to myself for a few years by the time your father came to me, and when he came back the third time, I saw a way to do something useful, and maybe, if I was very fortunate, to not be alone," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. This man who had come up a mountain to get far enough from something he couldn't name, and ended up in a silence that talked back. This man who had stood at an altar and waited without impatience while she found her two words. "I should have said something," she said, "at the wedding. I should have refused. You had nothing to go to. That's not your fault." "No," he said. "But it's not yours either." The fire, the stars outside, the cabin settling into the cold with its small comfortable sounds. Then she told him about Eleanor, not the death. That was too heavy for her, a night that was already sufficiently weighted. Just the fact of her, the quality of her mind, the specific way she had managed to love Jacob Voss and be disappointed by him simultaneously for 20 years without letting either one cancel out the other. A woman of considerable intelligence who had been made smaller by a life that didn't know what to do with intelligence in a woman. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Cord said. "She was—" Alora looked at her tea. "She told me once, 'The only thing you truly own is what you decide. Everything else can be taken. But a decision, once you have really made it, belongs to you.'" He was quiet. "She wasn't wrong," he said. The door left open now. "I need to tell you something about Cord Halloran that he never talked about, and that only makes sense as the background of everything you have already seen. You have to go back 20 years. Back to when Cord was 18 years old and working on someone else's land. 2 territories east of here, saving every dollar he earned toward a future he could see only an outline. Something with land in it, something that was his, something that didn't require him to be grateful to anyone. He had a sister. Her name was Clara. She was 12 years old, and she had their mother's eyes and a way of laughing that filled rooms. He had been sending money home when he could. Not enough. He told himself every month that next month he would send more, and next month came, and the expenses of being young and poor and ambitious had their own claims, and the money he sent was never quite what he had intended. The message found him in the East Field on a Tuesday. A rider, a folded piece of paper. Clara, fever. Gone 3 days ago. Come home if you can. He read it twice. Then he simply stood in the field, with the paper in his hand and the soil on his boots, and understood, with a specific and total understanding of something that cannot be ununderstood, that there was no coming home that meant anything. Now she was already buried. He had been in a field 2 territories away, saving money for his own future, while his 12-year-old sister died of a fever that might have been treatable if someone had been there to manage it. His parents were not cruel people, but grief finds the nearest available explanation and pins itself there, and the nearest available explanation for his parents was their son, who had gone away to chase his own life and had not been home when he was needed. They didn't say it often. They said it once, clearly, on the day of the funeral, and then it existed between them like a door that no one could close, because no one could agree on whether it should be closed. He left after the service. He spent the next 15 years moving through other people's work, saving toward something, buying this land eventually, building this cabin, convincing himself that he had found what he came for. The quiet, on some nights, disagreed. Now, here is the thing I want you to understand about the lock on Alora's door. He had ordered it before he went to town for the wedding. He had gone to the man in Bitterfield who made hardware to custom specification, and he had asked for a specific iron bolt, interior mount, sized for a standard door frame. He had carried it in his coat pocket all the way down the mountain and through the ceremony and back up again. He had thought about it before she arrived. He had planned for her fear before she had a chance to show it to him. A man who was not there when someone needed him once does not take chances with the people in his care afterward. He prepares. He gives them tools. He makes sure that whether or not they trust him, whether or not he has earned any trust at all, they have the means to be safe from him, if safe from him is what they need. That is what that lock was, not just a kindness, a penance and a promise, and the first installment of something he intended to keep paying for as long as it took. The morning after the storm cleared, Alora woke and lay in the gray early light and realized something she had done without deciding to do it. She had not locked the door. She had gone to bed the night before in the easy quiet after the fireside conversation, and she had simply not locked it. Not forgotten exactly. More set it aside, the way you set aside a tool when you no longer need it for the task at hand. She lay still and waited for the feeling. She expected the alarm, the recrimination, the urgency to correct it. It did not come. What came instead was a kind of mild and unceremonious recognition. The door was not locked. She was fine. The two facts coexisted without friction. She got up. She went to the main room. Cord was already outside, beginning the morning work. She could hear the axe in the woodpile, steady and unhurried, the sound of something necessary being done. She made coffee. She set 2 cups on the table. When he came in, he looked at the cups. He looked at her. He sat down without comment and wrapped his hands around his cup and drank it. The door to her room stood open behind her. Neither of them mentioned it. But something had changed in the cabin that morning, and they both knew it, and it did not need to be named to be real. The trap line. He took her out on the trap line for the first time in early December. They left before full light. She wore the ice grips and the canvas jacket and a wool hat she had found on the provision shelf one morning. not placed with any ceremony. Just there, as if it had always been there, though she was reasonably certain it had not been there the week before. She put it on without comment. He said nothing about it. They took their coffee outside and drank it in the dark while the horses stood ready, and then they rode north into the timber. The trail went up through stands of lodgepole pine, so dense that the snow could not reach the ground beneath them. The floor under the trees was clean needles and silence, and above the canopy the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, going from black to deep blue, to the particular pale gray that preceded real dawn. The cold was serious at this hour, and altitude, the kind of cold that required your full attention, that made you aware of every gap in your clothing and every ungloved inch of skin. He moved through the forest the way she had come to expect him to move through everything, reading it constantly, making small adjustments based on information she couldn't see yet. He read the snow. He read the light where it came through the trees at low angles. He read the tracks left by things that had moved through in the night. She could see the marks, but couldn't yet interpret them. Could see that he was interpreting them, but couldn't yet follow the reasoning. How do you know which way to go when the trail is covered? She asked. About an hour in, he stopped his horse. He pointed ahead to where the trees thinned by perhaps 20 yards in a long, irregular line running north to south. See where the canopy opens? That's where the creek runs. Trail follows the creek to the North Fork, then cuts east, up the second drainage. He looked at her to make sure she was seeing what he was pointing at. You read landmarks, not surfaces. The surface changes every storm. The structure underneath it doesn't. She looked at the thinned canopy, looked at the shape of the ground beneath the snow, the subtle depression that indicated water running below. It was right there, once he had given her the key to it. The information had been present the whole time. She simply hadn't known how to read it. What else? She said. He told her. For 3 hours going out and 3 hours coming back. He told her the mountain, the way some men tell the time, naturally, without stopping to consider whether the information was interesting, because it was simply the state of things, and therefore worth knowing, which drainages ran fast and which ran slow, and what the difference meant in spring when the snow melted, where the ground was solid and where it floated on ice. You couldn't detect from above where to find shelter if a storm built fast on the high ridge, where the elk crossed in November, and why, and what the crossing pattern told you about the season's severity. She listened the way she had always listened, completely and quietly, and storing everything. The skill had been built in her father's house, where you needed to read what was coming from, far enough away to prepare for it. On the mountain, the skill meant something entirely different. Here it kept you alive rather than simply intact. At the third trap, she watched him work. The quick, efficient handling of what the trap had caught, the reset, the care he took with the mechanism to ensure it would function correctly. She watched his hands, scarred and certain, doing exactly what they had done dozens and dozens before, no wasted motion. No hesitation. Does it bother you? She asked. Killing things. He looked up. It would bother me more to be cold. And hungry, he said. Then, after a pause, I don't do it for pleasure. There's a difference. She fuzzled this away with everything else. By the time they turned south, toward home, the light had changed to the low gold of a December afternoon, coming through the trees at the long angles of a sun that was barely clearing the ridge, even at its highest point. She was tired in a way that was entirely physical and entirely fine, the clean exhaustion of a body that has been used fully for a good reason. She was watching the trail ahead when she became aware that Cord had turned in his saddle and was looking at her with the particular attention he reserved for things he was assessing, and had not yet finished assessing. "You learn fast," he said. She looked at him. "I've had to," she said. He nodded once, slowly, and faced forward again. She rode behind him the rest of the way home and thought about the fact that he had said it at all. The fox. On the way back, the fox appeared. It came from the tree cover to the east, sudden and close, 30 yards ahead of them on the trail, bounding through the deep snow, with a particular effortless grace that had nothing to do with effort. The snow was up to its chest, and it moved through it anyway, as if the depth were irrelevant, each stride launching it forward in a long arc, red, against the white, bright, and improbable, and absolutely itself. She made a sound before she could stop herself. Frasp, not a gasp, not quite. Something smaller than that and less controlled. The involuntary small exhalation of a person who has been surprised by something that is simply, undeniably beautiful, and whose body has registered this before the mind had time to compose a measured response. Cord turned around. He looked at her face, and then he smiled. Not a polite smile, not the careful fractional curve she had seen once or twice in the months since October. Those small managed expressions that said something was acceptable or satisfactory or not as bad as anticipated. This was a real smile. Quick and unguarded, the kind that a person makes when something catches them entirely off guard, when the careful management of expression has been momentarily overtaken by something genuine. It changed his face completely. She had understood his face as a landscape, composed of specific elements, organized with a purpose, readable once you learned the vocabulary, but not given to variation. The jaw like quarried granite, the eyes like ice water, the particular set of his mouth when he was working or thinking or waiting, these were the reliable geography of him, and she had learned them over weeks of careful observation. The smile dismantled the geography, made him younger, made the jaw go soft and the eyes go warm, and the whole composition of his face become something she hadn't known it could be. He was, she realized with a small surprised shock, a man who laughed sometimes, had laughed once before whatever had put all that stone in his face had done its work. The laugh was still in there. The fox had found it. She looked back at the trail. He looked back at the trail. Neither of them said anything. The fox was gone, disappeared into the timber to the west as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only a set of prints in the snow that already had wind, beginning to soften their edges. They rode the rest of the way home without talking, which was not unusual, except that the silence had a different texture than the silences before it, less careful, less bounded, something in it that had a little room to move. When they got back to the cabin, she took care of her horse, and he took care of his. And they came in together for the evening, and she made the coffee while he built up the fire. And she thought about that smile for the rest of the night. She thought about the particular quality of a face that has been alone for a very long time, the way it learns to notice itself, the way the muscles that are used for expression toward other people slowly stop being called upon and begin to rest in their default positions. She thought about 12 years of that, and what it would take to undo even a small part of it. A fox jumping out of the snow. Apparently that was enough. She filed this away very carefully. Small kindnesses. The weeks between the first storm and Christmas settled into the best kind of difficult. She learned to split wood correctly, the real way, where you stop fighting the wood and start reading it, finding the grain and working with it instead of against it. Her hands blistered and healed and hardened. The blisters became calluses, became simply the surface of her hands. The way hands look when they have been used for real work, long enough to adapt to it. She learned to bank the fire before bed, the right combination of wood and ash to hold coals through the night. without attention, the particular arrangement that a fire needed to keep itself alive until morning. She learned it by doing it wrong, twice, and right on the third attempt, without being told what the correct approach was, because he had showed her the components and let her work out the sequence. She noticed that this was how he taught everything. He showed you the elements. He trusted you to assemble them. He corrected you once if you assembled them wrong, and then he moved on, as if the correction had already been absorbed, and there was no point lingering on it. It was the most efficient teaching she had ever experienced. It was also the most respectful. One morning she woke before him and had coffee ready by the time his door opened. He came into the main room and stopped. He looked at the stove. He looked at the 2 cups. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. The small softening around the eyes, the fractional relaxation of the jaw, the expression of a person who has received something they were not expecting and do not quite know where to put it. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He held it for a long moment before drinking. "Thank you," he said, quietly. "It's just coffee," she said. "Yes," he said. And they both understood it wasn't just coffee, and neither of them elaborated on that understanding. And the morning went on. He began leaving things, not gifts exactly, nothing with that kind of deliberate presentation, more like corrections he had noticed, needed making, and had made without discussion. The water bucket outside her door, already filled on the mornings, when the temperature had dropped enough to make the pump a genuine hardship. The firewood moved to the closer stack for a week, when her back was stiff from a day of heavy fence work. A pair of better work gloves left on the table during the second week of December when her old ones wore through. She left things too. She did not announce them. She simply left them. His coffee, always. The sharpened knife when she noticed it had gone dull and she had time before he'd need it. One evening she sat up after he had gone to bed and mended a tear in his heavy canvas coat that had been getting worse for 2 weeks, working by lamplight with the small, precise stitches. Her mother had taught her. She hung it back on its hook and said nothing about it. In the morning he put it on and she watched him. Noticed the mended seam. From across the room he ran his thumb along the stitching. Then he picked up his coffee and went outside. She ate her breakfast with a feeling she recognized distantly as something her mother had described once. The particular satisfaction of doing a thing well for a person who will understand what it cost. These were the small kindnesses of the mountain. They had no ceremony about them. They accumulated without announcement, settling into the fabric of the days the way snow settles into the landscape. Quietly, incrementally, until the shape of things was different from what it had been, and you could not point to the single moment when the change had occurred. Down to town, in February, Cord said they needed to go to Harland's Creek for supplies before the next cold system came through. She had known this was coming. She had been preparing for it with the careful, quiet part of her mind that never entirely stopped preparing for difficult things. She was more ready than she had been in October. She was not sure that made it easier. They rode down on a gray morning. 2 horses and a pack mule, moving through the snowpack with the easy competence of animals that knew this trail in every condition. The mountains fell away behind them as they descended, and the valley rose to meet them, and Harland's Creek appeared through the tree line as they cleared the last ridge. It looked smaller than she remembered. That surprised her. She had been up on the mountain for 4 months, and the town had been living in her mind at its full emotional size. The church, the pews, the faces turning to watch her walk the aisle. The actual place was smaller than all of that. The buildings were low, and the main street was brief, and the whole enterprise of it had the slightly provisional quality she had forgotten about, while she'd been away. The stairs began before they tied their horses. She felt them the way she always felt them. Not imagined, not sensitivity, misread, but actual physical sensation, the specific weight of collective attention landing on a person who represents an active topic of ongoing community interest. Conversations abbreviated. Postures adjusted. The particular quality of a public space rearranging itself around a subject it had been discussing moments before. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she walked into Patterson's general store without rushing and without hesitation. Helen Patterson greeted her with the careful professionalism of a woman who was going to be civil about this situation, if it required every resource she had. "Mrs. Halloran, what can I get for you?" The use of the name was a small test, applied with great subtlety. Alora did not flinch from it. She moved through the store with her list. Cord handled the feed order at the counter, with his usual efficiency, stating what he needed and waiting for it to be filled without small talk or performance. She worked her way along the shelves, gathering items, noting prices, doing the arithmetic of what remained in their provisions against what the winter still had ahead of it. She was near the bolts of cloth at the back of the store when she heard the voice. Well, Mrs. Halloran, Margaret Hollis. She knew the name. Everyone in Harland's Creek knew Margaret Hollis, the banker's wife, a woman in her mid-40s who moved through the town's social life, with the certainty of someone who had decided long ago that the gap between her standards and other people's conduct was a permanent, personal affront. "Mrs. Lewis," Alora said, "how are you finding your arrangement?" The pause before the final word was very precisely calibrated, not long enough to be called a pause by anyone who hadn't been watching for it. "I'm well, thank you. I'm sure you are." The smile did not reach anything above the mouth. "Must be something of a relief having your difficulties resolved so efficiently." Alora looked at her steadily. "My difficulties weren't resolved," she said. "They were traded for different ones. But at least now I'm working for my keep instead of watching my father drink it away." Something moved in Margaret's eyes. The calibrated response had not anticipated a response of its own. The conversation had been meant to be a brief demonstration, not an exchange, and it had become an exchange without her permission. Before Margaret could reconfigure, something else caught Alora's attention. Behind the counter, half turned away, was a young woman she had seen in this store before without seeing. Sarah Pruitt. She knew the name vaguely, the way you know names in a small town you have lived near for years without entering fully. Young, perhaps 20, with dark hair pulled back tight, and the posture of someone who has learned to make themselves as unobtrusive as possible in the spaces they are required to occupy. She was folding cloth with focused attention. Her eyes were down. She had gone completely still. When Margaret had spoken, the absolute stillness of an animal that has learned that stillness is the safest available response to nearby danger. There was a bruise above her right ear, yellowed at the edges, several days old. Their eyes met for 1 second, exactly, the specific second, of two people who have each seen something the other one is carrying and both know it and both know the other one knows it. Sarah looked down. Alora looked away. She finished her purchases at the counter and went outside and stood by the horses and waited for Cord to bring the feed sacks. And she thought about 1 second of eye contact and what it meant that a woman in a store in her hometown was carrying a bruise above her ear and had learned to go. Still, when trouble spoke nearby, the question cord loaded the pack mule while she stood at the hitching post. He worked with the systematic efficiency she had watched him bring to every physical task, assessing the load, distributing the weight, securing the lashing with knots that would hold through the mountain trail without binding. He did not look up while he worked. but she had been watching him long enough to know that not looking up was not the same as not being aware. He had been in the store when Margaret had spoken. The walls of Patterson's general store were not thick, and the store was not large. "You want to come back," he said, without looking up from the lashing. Not a question, exactly. More like a thing he had been carrying and had decided to set down. She looked at him. "What?" "To town. To stay." "It's not too late in the season." "I could." He tied off the lashing and looked at her then. "If you wanted to. I could arrange it." She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. He kept looking at her. He kept looking. "I'm not finished," she said, "with what I'm learning up there. I'm not done with it yet." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him reading her the way he read the mountain, looking for the thing underneath the surface, trying to understand the structure rather than the weather. Then he nodded. Once. Short and complete, and went back to checking the mule's cinch. No argument, no persuasion, no repetition of the offer in a slightly different form to see if she had really meant it. He had asked. She had answered. He had accepted the answer as the answer. And that was the end of it. She thought about that for the entire ride back up the mountain. She thought about the specific quality of a question that expects to be taken seriously and accepts the response it gets. She thought about how rare that was in her experience. Her father's questions had always been vectors, aimed at a predetermined destination, requiring only the answer that allowed the conversation to continue in the direction he needed it to go. Jacob Voss did not ask questions to hear answers. He asked questions to create openings. Cord asked questions to hear answers. The difference, she was understanding, was not a small one. By the time they crested the last ridge and the cabin came into view, the smoke from the chimney, going straight up in the cold, still air, the lean to quiet, with the horses they had left behind, the woodpile, standing solid against the gray sky. She had been thinking about the question for 2 hours and had arrived at something she hadn't expected to arrive at. She had said no without hesitation. She had not even needed to consider it. She had been afraid, in the first weeks, that what she was experiencing on this mountain was the specific adaptive mechanism of a person with no options, the way imprisoned things learn to be comfortable in their enclosure, because the alternative is despair. She had been watching herself carefully, signs of that particular accommodation. She had been honest with herself about watching for it, because dishonesty on that point would have been the most dangerous kind. But the question had come, and the no had come before the question had finished arriving, and it had not felt like someone choosing the lesser misery. It had felt like someone choosing the thing they wanted. She wasn't certain yet what to do with that, but she held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile on a mountain trail, with full attention and both hands. The long winter January arrived with a cold that was personal about it. The temperature dropped to places she did not have previous reference points for. Cold that was not a condition, but an active force pressing through every gap, contracting the cabin walls so they popped in the night, turning breath through to vapor before it cleared the mouth. She learned the difference between cold that killed you quickly, and cold that killed you slowly, and cold that was merely uncomfortable. On this mountain, in this season, all three were regular visitors. The days shortened until the sun barely cleared the southern ridge at noon and was gone again, before the afternoon had properly established itself. They worked in low light and came inside in dark, and the evening stretched long and firelit, and the cabin, which had felt small in October, had become, through the accumulation of months, something she could only think of as familiar. They talked more, not the careful, bounded conversations of the first weeks. Those exchanges, conducted with a particular caution, of two people who are assessing each other's safe distances. Something freer than that. The talk of people who have been through a winter together and have established that neither one is going to damage the other catastrophically. He told her about the years of moving, the work on other people's land, the slow accumulation of money toward something. He could only see an outline. He told it without embellishment or self-pity, as a sequence of events that had happened and that he had navigated and that had eventually brought him here. And the telling had the quality of a man who has decided that his past is simply information rather than a wound to be managed. She told him more about Eleanor. The full version this time, not the careful abbreviated one she had offered during the storm. She told him about the brightness of her mother's mind and the specific way a life that didn't know what to do with brightness in a woman had worked on it over years. She told him about the evenings when Eleanor would be sharp and exact and luminous in her analysis of something, a book, a problem, the situation of a neighbor, and then Jacob would come in from wherever he had been, and the luminosity would simply go off, like a lamp, being turned down to conserve oil. She made herself small, Alora said, not because she had to, because she had decided it was easier, that the cost of being fully herself was higher than what she got in return. She looked at the fire. I used to think she was wrong to make that decision, that she should have fought harder. Now I understand the arithmetic better. What changed your understanding? He asked. She thought about it. Honestly. Coming here, she said, seeing what it costs to not be small, seeing that the cost is real and the price is worth it. He was quiet for a moment, then, what's the price? Everything comfortable, she said. All the arrangements that work as long as you stay inside them. The approval of people who need you to stay inside them. And what do you get? She looked at her hands, hands that were harder than they had been, in October, more capable, more certain of themselves. Yourself, she said. You get yourself. The fire burned. The wind worked at the eaves in the way it had been working at them all winter, and she had stopped hearing it as threatening months ago. Now, it was just the mountains' weather doing what mountain weather did, requiring the same response it always required. Preparation and patience and the willingness to outlast it. She slept without locking her door every night now, and had been doing so for weeks, and no longer gave the unlocked door any particular thought. It had ceased to be a statement and become simply the state of things. The door open or closed on the latch, depending on the draft, but never bolted, never needing to be. One evening she looked up from the harness strap she was mending and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen before, not the evaluative attention she had catalogued in the early months, something quieter, something that had less calculation in it and more of whatever lived underneath calculation. She looked back down at the harness strap. He looked back at whatever he had been doing. But the fire in the cabin had a different quality after that, the kind of warmth that isn't only about temperature. The photograph one afternoon in late January, she was reorganizing the upper shelf, the one above the door, which she had not touched since she arrived because it held his things, and she had not felt she had standing to touch his things. When she found the photograph, small, maybe 3 inches by 4, protected by a piece of thin cardboard folded around it, she opened the cardboard without thinking, and then stood looking at what she had found. A girl, perhaps 11 or 12, dark hair, dark eyes, a face that was clearly related to the face she had been watching for months, the same structure, the same particular angle of the jaw, but lighter in it, younger, obviously, but also something else. A quality in the expression that she could only call unguarded. This girl had not yet learned to hold her face the way Cord held his. She was simply present in the photograph, entirely herself, looking at whoever was behind the camera with an expression of comfortable trust. Alora stood on the step stool with the photograph in her hands for a long moment. She climbed down. She looked at the shelf, and then, with care, she moved the photograph to the shelf by the west window, the one that caught the morning light directly, the one she dusted twice a week, the one where things placed were things intended to be seen rather than stored. She put it there and climbed back up and continued reorganizing the upper shelf. That evening, Cord came in from the afternoon work. He poured coffee. He sat at the table. And at some point, in the natural movement of his gaze around the room, his eyes found the photograph on the window shelf. He went still. Not the productive stillness of a man at work or at rest. The other kind. The stillness of a person who has encountered something they were not prepared for and is taking the time to decide what to do with the encounter. She kept her eyes on the darning in her lap. He was still for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he picked up his coffee and drank it, and the evening continued. He didn't say anything that night about the photograph, or about Clara, or about 12 years of keeping a picture in a folded piece of cardboard on a high shelf that no one else was meant to touch. But the next morning, when she came in to the main room, the photograph was still where she had put it, on the shelf by the west window, in the path of the morning light. He had not moved it back. She made coffee. She set out the cups. She thought about the particular courage required to leave something you have been hiding in a place where the morning light can find it. The specific decision of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has begun, tentatively and without announcement, to put it down. She thought about her mother's voice. Don't let them make you small. She thought about how the promise worked in both directions, that it was not only about not being made small by others, but about not making yourself small through the accumulation of things you kept folded up on high shelves. She thought about a 12-year-old girl with their mother's eyes and a way of laughing that filled rooms. She thought about the man in the lean-to this morning, doing the first work of the day, carrying what he carried, setting down what he was beginning to set down. When he came in, she handed him his coffee without looking at him. He took it without comment. They ate breakfast in the easy silence that their mornings had become, with the photograph in the morning light on the shelf and the mountain outside, doing what mountains do, and the fire between them, warm and steady and entirely theirs. She thought, I am going to be all right here. Not surviving, not enduring, not making the best of something that had started wrong. All right, in the full and actual sense of the phrase. In the sense her mother had meant when she'd said it, which was not safe and not comfortable and not without difficulty, but rather in right alignment with herself, doing the thing that was true. She was going to be all right here, and if that was not the same as the life she would have chosen from a position of complete freedom, well, she was beginning to understand that the life you choose under constraint and the life you choose from freedom were not necessarily as different as she had assumed. The choosing was the thing, the quality and honesty of the choosing. Whether you were doing it because you had to, or because, having looked clearly at what was available, this was what you wanted. She was choosing this, not today for the first time, not in a single dramatic moment of decision, but every morning in the daily accumulation of small choices that added up over time to a life. Outside, the mountain winter went about its serious business. Inside, two people who had come to this place by separate roads, and for different reasons sat at the same table in the same morning light, and the photograph of a girl who had laughed and filled rooms sat in the light on the shelf, and the door to the bedroom on the left stood open, and none of these things required explanation. They were simply true. Spring on the mountain didn't arrive so much as negotiate its way in. It came in pieces, the way all true things come, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small evidence that something was changing and could not be changed back. A morning in late February, when the light had a different quality, still cold but carrying something in it that hadn't been there the week before, a particular slant that said, "I am only passing through this angle and will not return until next year." Then a week of hard freeze that made it seem like winter had reconsidered then. A morning when she woke to the sound of water moving under the ice in the creek behind the cabin, liquid and purposeful, working its way through, doing what it had always been going to do. She went outside before breakfast that morning and stood in the yard and listened to the creek. The snow was still deep on the north-facing slopes, packed and blue-shadowed in the early light, but the south wall of the cabin had a drip line along its base where the eaves met the ground, small and tentative. Not yet a true melt, but the first suggestion of one. The horses were restless in the lean-to, moving with the particular alertness of animals that sense a change in season before any other evidence confirms it. The mountain was turning. She found the first green shoot of sorrel coming up beside the smokehouse foundation on a Thursday morning in early March. She crouched down and looked at it for a long time. Such a specific and certain small thing, unbothered by the months of snow and cold and the long dark above it, doing exactly what it was designed to do, in exactly the sequence it was designed to do it. She didn't know why it made her throat tight. She just crouched there in the cold air and looked at it until she heard Cord come out of the barn. Behind her. "Spring," she said, without turning around. He came and stood beside her and looked at the small green thing coming up through the cold ground. "Give it 2 weeks," he said. "After that, it'll be everywhere. Does it always come back?" "Every year I've been here." She stood up and brushed the cold from her knees. "Good," she said, and went in to start breakfast. The days lengthened visibly now, each one carrying a few more minutes of light than the one before. She noticed it first in the evenings, the way the western sky held its color longer, going from gold to deep orange to purple before the stars came, instead of dropping straight from afternoon to dark, the way it had been doing since November. She noticed it. In the mornings, too, the way the birds were back, before the light was fully up, doing the loud and uncomplicated work of announcing themselves. The mountain was different in spring than it had been in any other season, less sealed, more permeable. The frozen creeks became loud and fast with meltwater. The trails that had been packed hard and certain became soft in the afternoons, and reefer froze overnight, requiring a different kind of attention to navigate safely. New sounds appeared in the timber that she had not heard before. The creak and crack of snow sliding from the upper branches, the distant rumble of something larger shifting on the high ridge. She had been here long enough now to hear the difference between dangerous sounds and simply large ones. She had been here long enough to know the difference between a great many things she had not known when she arrived. The visit, the truth about the money, did not come from gossip. It came on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of March, when the trail down to the main road had been clear for 4 days, and she was working in the kitchen, garden, and Cord was in the barn. And the world had the quiet particular to a mountain afternoon, when the wind has stopped and the snow has settled and nothing is pressing. She heard the hooves before she saw the horse. She knew the sound before she saw the animal. The uneven rhythm of a horse carrying more weight than it was kept for, and ridden longer than was good for it. She stood up from the garden bed and shaded her eyes and watched her father come around the lower bend of the trail. He looked worse than she remembered. Not so much older as diminished, the way a fire looks in its last hour. The same shape, considerably less substance. His coat was wrong for the altitude and the temperature. He rode with the particular uprightness of a man managing the mechanics of appearing sober. He was not sober. She stood in the yard and let him come to her. She did not walk out to meet him. She did not call out a greeting. She stood with her hands at her sides, and her feet solid on the ground, that she had been working in since October, and let him make the full distance, while she decided who she was going to be for this. "There she is," he said, pulling the horse up with hands that were slightly imprecise. He attempted a smile. "There's my girl." She said nothing. He dismounted badly, catching himself on the saddle horn with both hands, while his legs recalled their purpose. The horse stood with its head low and its ears slack, past caring about the indignity of its situation. "Came to see how you're getting on," Jacob said, straightening up. "A man's got a right to check on his daughter." "You gave up rights some time ago," she said. "What do you actually want?" He looked wounded. The wounded expression was well practiced. She had seen it so many times that she could track its assembly in real time. The way the brows came together, and the chin came up, and the eyes went to a particular softness that was meant to communicate, hurt but communicated, mostly habit. "Can't a father just want to see his child? This one can't," she said, "not without something else attached to it." He shifted his weight. He looked around the property with the unconscious appraising tension of a man who cannot help calculating the value of things, even when calculating would embarrass him. The woodpile, the lean-to, the winterized garden beds, she had been working back to order. "You've done well for yourself," he said, with the ease of a man taking credit for a situation he created rather than one he inflicted. "I always knew you'd land on your feet. What do you want?" "Jacob?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular resignation of a man reaching for the option he had intended all along, "I'm in a tight spot." Again, the word again came out with a kind of rueful self-deprecation, as if the repetition were evidence of charming consistency rather than structural failure. "Just a small loan. Enough to cover the month. You're my daughter and I." "No, I'm not asking for much. Just no." He tried several more configurations of the same request over the next 10 minutes. She said no to each of them, with decreasing elaboration, because elaboration was something she had been giving him for years, and it had never once been useful. He heard no as a negotiating position. She was done negotiating. Then he said something that changed the shape of the conversation entirely. "You know," he said, with the careless air of a man producing a card he has been holding, "Harlland paid more than the bank wanted. Did you know that?" She looked at him. 2,100 was the "but I." "There are costs involved in arrangements like this. My time, my effort, the trouble I went to on everyone's behalf." The smile was thinner now, more honest in its way. I suggested a more complete figure, covered all the costs of the situation. "How much?" "It was a fair price." "Given? How much did you take from him?" A pause. That was very precisely shaped to look like consideration rather than calculation. I asked for 4,500 total. The bank got the 2,100 they were owed. The rest, you took $2,400 from him, I arranged. You told the whole town he paid 4,500 for me. The words came out quietly, each one placed with the care of something fragile that was also something sharp. You let everyone in Harland's Creek believe that number. You let them say it in the store and the saloon and the church. You let that be the story they told. Jacob's chin came up. "I did what was necessary for. You made me the evidence of your theft." Still quiet. She was not going to raise her voice. She had decided this before he arrived, in the 30 seconds between hearing his hooves and seeing his face. She was not going to give him the drama of a raised voice. "You used me to steal from him, and then you sent me away so you didn't have to watch me carry the story of it." "I carried it every single time I walked into that town." I heard what people said about the price, and I carried it. And you knew. Jacob's face moved through several configurations. What finally settled on it was not quite shame. She wasn't certain. He was fully capable of shame in the complete sense, but something adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has been seen more clearly than he is comfortable with, and doesn't have an immediate response to the clarity. Alora, don't. I made a decision I thought was best for... You made a decision that was best for you. That is the only decision you have ever made. She looked at him, all of him, the whole inventory of what the years had made of Jacob Voss. You want to know the worst part? You came up. Here today I would feel sorry for you. You told me about the money, thinking I would see it as a kind of honesty between us. Something we could shake our heads about together. She paused. That is who you are. That has always been who you are. He was quiet. The horse moved its weight from one foot to the other behind him. Get back on your horse, she said. Alora, get on your horse, Jacob. And don't come back up here without being invited. Don't hold your breath for the invitation. She turned and walked to the cabin. You've changed, he called after her. She heard it and kept walking. You used to be a sweet girl, she stopped. She did not turn around. I grew up, she said. You should try it, she went inside. What? Cord knew. She stood in the middle of the main room with both hands flat on the work table and breathed outside. She could hear her father's monologue, the running self-justification of a man who needed to maintain the version of events in which he was not the central problem. She heard him try to mount the horse twice before he managed it. She heard the hooves move away down the trail, uneven and diminishing, and then gone. She kept her hands on the table and breathed until the sound of him had been replaced entirely by the sound of the mountain, which was the wind in the timber, and the creek talking under its thinning ice, and the horses moving in the lean-to. She heard the barn door. She heard Cord's boots on the yard, and then on the porch, and then the door. He had been in the barn. The barn was not far from the garden. Sound travels cleanly on a mountain in still air. He had heard enough. She could tell from the quality of his stillness when he came in, the particular stillness of a person who has information he didn't seek and is deciding what to do with having it. He went to the stove. He put water on without asking. She looked at his back. You knew, she said. He didn't turn around. About the money. You knew when you paid it. The bank told you the real number. A pause. Then, yes, when? When I paid the bank directly. He turned around now and looked at her with the same quality of attention she had learned to trust over the past months. Present and honest, and not managing itself for her benefit. The teller told me the outstanding balance was $2,100. I asked what your father had requested. She told me $4,500. He held her gaze. I paid the bank their $2,100. I gave the remaining $24 to your father because he told me you would need it. For clothes. For settling in. I assumed he would give it to you. He didn't. I know. You've known all this time. Yes. She looked at him. Why didn't you tell me? He was quiet for a moment. The water on the stove began to stir. What would you have done with it when you were still trying to decide whether to trust me? He wasn't asking to deflect. He was asking a genuine question. You were 3 weeks on a mountain with a man you didn't know. What would that information have been to you? She thought about it, honestly. About the woman she had been in October, lying in the dark, holding an iron bolt. About the arithmetic of desperation and what it does to a person's capacity to absorb more complexity. I would have assumed you were the same, she said slowly. Another man with an arrangement? Another thing being managed without my knowledge? Yes, he said. So I waited. For what? For it to be information, he said. Instead of a weapon, she sat down at the table. She looked at her hands, not the hands she'd had in October, soft from a life of indoor work. These hands, harder and more certain with the particular capability of hands that have been used for real things. He told the whole town. "The full number," she said. "Everyone in Harland's Creek thinks you paid $4,500 for me. That's the story. That's what I cost, Alora. No, I know it's not, Alora." His voice was quiet and certain. "Whatever number your father invented and told whoever he told it to, that is not a price. That is not what you are. What the town thinks you cost has no bearing on what you're worth." She looked up at him. He looked back at her without flinching, without the discomfort that usually accompanied true things, said under difficult circumstances. He just said it and let it stand. "I'm angry," she said. "You're allowed to be. I'm angry at him. I'm angry at all of it. I'm angry that I have to keep." She stopped. "I spent years managing the consequences of his choices. I thought coming here was something different, and it is something different, but he's still in it somehow. He's still in the middle of it." "He won't come back," Cord said. "You don't know that." "No. But if he does, it'll go the same way today went." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "He came looking for weakness, and he didn't find any. Men like him don't press where there's nothing soft to press against. He'll find somewhere else." The water came to a simmer. He got up and made tea without being asked, something he had been doing since January, as naturally as he did everything else, without announcement or expectation of notice. He set a cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. "There's something else," he said. He sat back down. "About the land?" She waited. "The trail that runs through this property, north from the main road, through the high timber, to the camps above the basin." "It's not just a trail." He folded his hands on the table. "It's the only practical route through this section of the range when the high camps open fully. The operations up north have been expanding for 3 years, another season or two, and they'll need a reliable supply line through this corridor. Whoever controls this trail controls access to everything above it." She was very still. "Your father knew this," she said. "Someone told him, or he worked it out. Either way, yes, he knew what the land was worth beyond what I paid for it. And by putting you here, he thought he was keeping a thread connected to it. For when it mattered, she looked at the fire for a long time. So I was the thread," she said. "That was his thinking. He never asked me to be the thread. No. He built this situation and assumed the thread would hold." She thought about this, about what it meant to be used as an instrument without being consulted about the purpose, about the specific and familiar texture of that, the way it had been her entire life, the way Jacob Voss had always operated, and the way she had always been the thing he operated with rather than the person he operated alongside. Then she thought about something else. "He wanted to use me, to stay connected to something valuable," she said slowly. "He just didn't think about the fact that I would become valuable on my own." Cord looked at her. "This is our land," she said. "Not his, not a thread back to him, ours. And whatever we build on it, that's ours too. He gets nothing. Whatever he thought he was arranging, the arrangement went somewhere he didn't plan for." She picked up her tea. "Pack route," she said. He looked at her. "What if the trail is the only practical access to the high camps? We should be running a supply operation. Horses, mules, whatever those camps need, we supply it. We know this trail better than anyone. We know this mountain better than anyone." He was quiet for a moment. "That would take more stock, capital we don't currently have. How much?" he thought, with the genuine consideration he brought to practical problems. "A strong season's revenue. Maybe 2, if we're careful. Can we start smaller? 2 or 3 animals, prove the route, then scale. Yes, then we start smaller." He looked at her across the table. The firelight moved between them. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "Since you told me about the land?" She set down the cup. "I started thinking about what we could build on it that had nothing to do with what he wanted from it. The thing that moved across Cord Halloran's face in that moment. She had seen pieces of it before, in different configurations, and on different occasions. The quick, unguarded smile when the fox jumped from snow. The quiet softening when she'd had coffee ready before he asked for it. But this was different from both of those. This was all of them together, assembled at once, the expression of a man who has traveled a very long distance to find a thing he had stopped expecting to find, and has found it in a form he never thought to look for. He didn't say any of that. He wasn't built for sentences of that length or that exposure. He said, "All right," and he got up and found paper and a pencil. They worked on it for the rest of the afternoon. The paper filled up with trail notes and seasonal windows and lists of what they needed and what they needed to learn. She brought things to the table he hadn't considered. He brought things she hadn't. It was close to dark when she looked up and realized they had been working side by side for 3 hours, and it had felt like nothing except the right use of an afternoon. She filed that away, too. She was building quite a collection. Sarah, the woman, behind the counter at Patterson's General Store, was named Sarah Pruitt, and Alora had seen her 3 times now, once in February, once in early March, and each time she had seen her, she had seen the same things: the careful posture, the trained economy of movement, the eyes that stayed down when trouble spoke nearby and came up only in the brief, unguarded moments between one vigilance and the next, and the marks. The February bruise had been above her right ear, yellowed and fading. The March one had been on her jaw, covered imperfectly by her hair. Alora had seen them both, and had filed them away with the specific and painful kind of filing that a person does when they know what they are seeing, but do not yet have the standing or the plan to act on it. In early April, she rode down to town alone. Cord had given her the horse without asking why she was going, which was one of the things she had come to depend on. Without realizing, she had come to depend on it. She rode down the mountain in the spring morning and tied up outside Patterson's and walked in with no particular pretext and found what she had expected to find. Helen Patterson was in the back. The store was quiet. Sarah was behind the counter, stacking bolts of cloth with the focused attention of someone who has found that sustained focus on small tasks is one of the more reliable defenses against a difficult interior life. The bruise today was on her cheekbone. This one was newer. It had not yet finished deciding what color it was going to be. Alora walked to the counter. Sarah looked up. The 1-second eye contact, the same as always, the same specific second of mutual recognition. "How long?" Alora said. Not a question. A door being opened directly. Sarah's hands stilled on the fabric. "I don't know what." "How long, Sarah?" A long pause. The kind of pause that costs something. 4 years, Sarah said. Her voice was very quiet. "Do you have people anywhere, family?" "My sister." "Millvale." 2 days east. "Can you ride?" A shorter pause this time. "Yes, then you have a choice," Alora said. "It's yours to make, and I won't make it for you. But you have one. That's what I came to tell you." She held Sarah's gaze for a moment. Then she went to the shelf and selected the items from her list and paid for them and walked out. She mounted up and rode back toward the mountain and thought about a woman with a 4-year bruise, learning that the word choice still belonged to her. She told Cord that evening what she had done. Not everything. The details belonged to Sarah, but enough. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. "What did she say?" "She said yes when I asked if she could ride." He was quiet. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he said, "that's not nothing." He looked at the fire for a moment, then, "I knew John Miller years ago. Before any of this," she looked at him. "He came to me in Bitterfield wanting to hire on for a high camp supply run. I had work going through the season, and he needed the income." Cord was looking at his hands, not at her. I watched him for an afternoon before I gave him an answer. The way he talked to the horses, the way he spoke to the woman selling water at the market gate. A pause. The way he looked at Sarah when she crossed the street. What did you see? A man who looked at things and calculated their use value. He said it without particular inflection. Just accurate description, not cruelty, exactly absence. He looked at living things and saw what they were good for. He looked at her. I refused the contract without explaining why. I've thought about that since Sarah's situation became clear to me. What I should have done differently. You couldn't have. I saw enough to act on, and I didn't act on it. He was not angry at himself exactly. He said it, the way. He said most true things plainly as a statement of fact that required neither embellishment nor excuse. So when Thomas came with the news last week, I was glad you were already moving. Alora looked at him, because this time, he said, I was going to act on it. The gathering. Thomas Carver rode up on a Thursday afternoon with the look of a man delivering news he would have preferred not to carry. John Miller had been talking. To the other businessmen, to the husbands, building a case in the way of men who feel the ground shifting under their established arrangements and respond by appealing to the larger system to hold it in place. He was calling for a community gathering at the church. He was framing it, Thomas said, as a question of standards, of proper conduct, of what the community could and could not tolerate in the behavior of its members. He meant Alora. The framing was civic, but the target was specific. When? She said. Sunday week. We'll be there, she said. Thomas began the expression of the cautionary qualification she could see assembling itself in his face. She stopped him before it arrived. We'll be there, Thomas. Thank you for telling us. He nodded and rode. The cabin was quiet after his horse faded. Cord was at the table. She stood at the window and looked at the mountain going from gold to purple in the evening light and thought about what was coming. You don't have to, Cord said. She turned around. I know, she said. We're going. He looked at her for a moment with the measuring attention she knew well by now, reading the structure beneath the surface, assessing what was solid and what was weather. Then, what do you need from me? Not, let me handle it. Not, are you certain? Not, we should consider. What do you need from me? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything now, with the clarity that had been coming for months, building from small daily decisions, the way muscles from small daily use. Stand beside me, she said. Not in front, not speaking for me. Just be there. Yes, he said. Civil and complete. She went to bed that night and slept better than she had any right to expect, and woke in the clear April morning with the particular calm of a person who has been moving toward something for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment of it. The speech they rode into Harland's Creek on a Sunday morning under a sky so blue it looked painted. Every pew was full. She knew before they walked through the doors. She could feel the density of the gathering from the street, the particular atmosphere of a space that his face had been filling for an hour, with people who have come with opinions already formed and are waiting for the occasion to formalize them. She had felt this atmosphere before. The morning of her wedding. This was the same room, the same faces, the same quality of collective anticipation. This time was different. This time. She knew what she had learned on that mountain and in those months and in the daily accumulation of decisions that had built her. Into the person walking through the door. They took their usual seats, the pew that was always empty except for them. She sat with her spine straight and her hands quiet in her lap, and she looked at the front of the room and waited. Pastor Green opened. He spoke of community and standards and the importance of addressing concerns directly. Margaret Hollis rose from the third pew and did not wait to be called upon. She spoke of proper conduct and the sanctity of marriage, and the example being set by certain members of the community. She was precise and composed, and her voice carried the particular authority of a woman who has operated unchallenged for long enough that challenge has ceased to seem like a real possibility. The room listened. Alora listened. She counted, while she listened, the faces that were looking at the floor. There were more than she expected when Margaret reached the end of her prepared remarks. She looked at Alora with the particular expression of a woman who has organized something and expects it to conclude in the way she organized it to conclude. Alora stood up. She stepped into the center aisle. The room went quiet in the genuine way. Not imposed silence, but the silence of a space where everyone has simultaneously decided to listen. She looked at Margaret Hollis. Then she looked at the rest of the room. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steady. Not loud. The room was quiet enough, and I'd ask you to let me finish before you decide what to think about it. Nobody spoke. I came to this town 8 months ago. As a girl who had been handed from one set of circumstances to another without being asked what she wanted, my father made a decision on my behalf. He told me what was happening, and he called my silence agreement, and I was afraid and out of options, and so I let it stand. She paused. I am not ashamed of that. That is simply what happened. She heard Margaret begin something. She continued without acknowledging it. Every person in this room who was sitting in these pews on the morning of my wedding, not one of you asked me what I thought. Not one of you came to me beforehand and said, "Alora, do you want this?" Not one of you treated my opinion about my own life as something worth having. The silence was very complete. He did. She did not look at Cord. She did not need to. First night, he put a lock on my door. He handed me the key, and he told me that the decision was mine to make. She let that sit for a moment. Not his mind. In a world that had spent 19 years treating my choices as inconveniences, this man put a lock on my door and said, "You should have a choice, because you should." A sound from the middle rose. Someone who had not intended to make a sound. I'm not standing here to tell you our arrangement started right. She continued. It started wrong. The way that desperate decisions made under pressure with incomplete information tend to start wrong. But here is what I am telling you. She looked at the room, all of it, pew by pew, face by face. I am not on that mountain because I was sold there. I am not there because I have no options. I am not there because I am too broken or too afraid to find my way to something else. She paused. I am there because I chose to be. Because when spring came and the trail was clear and I could have ridden down that mountain and kept riding, I didn't. I stayed. I stayed because it is the first place I have ever lived where someone treated my choice like it mattered, where the work I do belongs to me, where the life I'm building is mine to build. She let the room hold that for a moment. You can call that irregular, she said. You can measure it against whatever standard you like and find it wanting. But I know what it cost to get here, and I know what I found when I arrived. And the only story about my life that is true is the one I'm telling right now. She looked at Margaret Hollis directly. Not the one that has been told in my absence. Then she said the 3 sentences that had been forming in her for months, assembling themselves in the cold and the quiet and the long winter evenings, waiting for exactly this room and this moment. I did not choose to come here, but I chose to stay, and that choice is mine. Not yours, not his, not anyone's but mine. She sat down. The room was absolutely still. Margaret Hollis opened her mouth for the first time in Alora's experience of her, in all the months of careful targeted cruelty, all the precisely calibrated comments in stores and on streets and in church pews. Margaret Hollis had nothing ready. She opened her mouth and closed it, opened it again. Her composure was architecturally intact. The posture, the expression, the controlled surface of a woman who had been managing appearances for 20 years and was not going to stop now. But behind her eyes, something was happening that was separate from the public face, something that looked, in the particular morning light, coming through the church windows, almost like a woman encountering a mirror she had not arranged, and finding the reflection complicated. The silence stretched. Then from the back of the church a voice spoke, small and clear and more steady than Alora would have predicted. She's right. Sarah Pruitt was standing in the last pew. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her face was pale, but composed with the composure of someone who has spent a night deciding to say something and has arrived at the morning of it. When Mrs. Halloran spoke to me, she said, I had spent 4 years being told that what was happening to me was just what marriage was, what I was supposed to accept. Her voice was steady, with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided the cost of speaking is less than the cost of continued silence. She didn't tell me what to do. She told me I had a choice. That's all. That a choice existed. John Miller was on his feet. Sit down, John, Sheriff Dawson said from the side wall. Not a request. Miller looked at the sheriff. Something moved between them in the space of a second. Miller sat. Have a choice now, Sarah continued. I'm making it. I want the people in this room to understand that telling a woman she has a choice is not destruction. It is not the end of family or community or anything worth having. She looked at Margaret Hollis. It is the beginning of the only thing worth having, which is a life that belongs to the person living it. She sat down. Helen Patterson rose from the back. I've been in this town 30 years, she said, with the economy of a woman accustomed to transactions. What I've seen of Cord and Alora Halloran this winter is two people doing the work of a life together. I don't know a better definition of a marriage than that. She sat down. Pastor Green looked at Margaret Hollis. Mrs. Lewis, did you have something further to add? Margaret stood at the front of the room, with 22 years of practiced certainty arranged around her like armor. And she said, no, one word, quiet and complete. The room breathed. Then I think we're concluded, Pastor Green said. What remains? They walked out into the April sunlight, and the day was exactly as bright as it had been when they rode in. Thomas Carver found her on the steps. That needed saying, he told her. For a long time, he shook Cord's hand and walked away. Helen Patterson touched briefly on the arm and said, come Tuesday. I've got something to show you, and gave no further information. An older woman, whose name she only knew, vaguely stopped and said, I should have spoken to you months ago, and moved on before Alora could answer. John Miller mounted his horse at the far end of the street and rode south without looking back. She watched him go. He would do something with his anger. That was certain. But the audience he had organized for it had shifted under his feet, and shifting audiences changed what anger could accomplish. And he would find that out in his own time. She and Cord walked to their horses and rode home. That evening after dinner, she was at the table with the trail maps. She had pulled them out after they ate, beginning the work of planning in earnest now that the spring was real and the route needed to be assessed, and prepared when she heard him come back in from the evening check of the animals. He sat down across from her. He reached inside his coat and laid something on the table between them. She looked at it, a folded document. She opened it, the county surveyor's seal, the description of the land, the cabin and outbuildings, the timber rights, the trail access, the northern boundary running to the high basin, all of it described in the precise and impersonal language of legal property. And two names, Cord Halloran and Alora Halloran. Nay Wren, joint and equal proprietors. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked at him. He was watching her with the quiet, full attention she had come to know, as his particular form of care. "I had it drawn up in Bitterfield last week," he said. "When I went for hardware—" "Why?" "Because you've worked this land since October. You've built things on it and learned it and made it better." He folded his hands on the table. "It's yours because you've made it yours. This just makes it official." He held her gaze. "And because you should be able to leave and take half of everything with you, so that we both know when you stay, it's because you want to, not because you have nowhere else to go." The fire made its small sounds. The mountain held its enormous darkness outside the windows. She thought about the iron bolt on the bedside table on the first night. The same gesture, different form. The same thing underneath. He had been doing this since the beginning, handing her the tools for her own freedom at every juncture, making sure that what she chose freely. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "But now you're staying because you want to. That matters." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she folded the document and placed it in her coat pocket, and she pulled the nearest map toward her, and she said, "Wren and Hale." He looked at her. "For the operation." She said, "Not Halloran's. Not just yours. Wren and Hale. Both names." In that order. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them threw its warm light across the maps. "Wren and Hale," he said. "Yes, all right." She looked at the map. He leaned forward to look at the same section. She was tracing a route with her finger, the north approach, the traverse to the high basin, when she felt his hand come down beside hers on the paper, not on top of hers. Beside it, following the same route from a slightly different angle. Their fingers touched at the edge of the trail marker. Neither of them moved the fire, the lamp. The mountain outside doing what mountains do. She turned her hand. Just that. The simple turning of her hand from pointing to resting, so that her fingers were alongside his, rather than beside them. He went still. Then his hand turned under hers, and his fingers closed around her fingers. And that was all. Nothing announced, nothing dramatic, just the quiet completion of something that had been moving toward this for a very long time, in the patient and unhurried way that everything on this mountain moved toward the things it was moving toward. "The north, section first," she said. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand. "Yes," he said, "the north section first," and they went back to the maps. Wren and Hale ran its first supply run to the high camps in June of 1888. 6 animals, 3 horses, and 3 mules. The mules purchased from a man in Bitterfield, who had been trying to sell them for a season. Alora had gone to see them, and had come back and told Cord what they were worth and what to offer, and he had offered it, and the transaction had been completed without drama. The roan, Scout, went on that first run, carrying light loads, learning the trail in stages, doing exactly what patient work and patient handling had been preparing her to do. They ran 4 more trips that summer, 6 the following summer. The season after that, they hired Thomas Carver's younger brother part-time, and the summer after that, they hired him full-time, and by the time the decade turned the name Wren and Hale, was known the length of the mountain range as the operation that knew every trail, every rail, every weather window, and would get your supplies through when nobody else could. The name went in that order. Always, Sarah Pruitt did not leave Harland's Creek. She moved into the room above Patterson's store and was working the counter within the week, and within a month, Helen Patterson had stopped calling it temporary. John Miller left Harland's Creek in the fall of 1888 and went south, and the town lost track of him in the way that towns lose track of people they have collectively decided to stop paying attention to. Sarah Pruitt, without anyone making a ceremony of it, became simply Sarah, a woman who had made a hard choice and was building something on the other side of it. The first time Alora rode through town on a supply run with the string of pack animals behind her, Sarah was at the door of the store. They looked at each other through the morning light for 1 second. Sarah raised one hand, barely. Alora raised hers back. They kept moving. That was enough. They filed the deed at the county seat in Bitterfield the week after the gathering. The clerk looked at it twice, then looked at them, then processed it without comment, though the set of his mouth carried several unspoken observations. He had apparently decided to keep in their current location. They were on the steps going down when they saw her, Margaret Hollis, coming up. Alone, which was unusual. She knew they would be here. Information traveled in Harland's Creek, the way water traveled on the mountain, finding every available channel. She had come deliberately. She looked at Alora. She looked at the county office behind them. "I heard what you were doing," she said. "Yes," Alora said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at the street with the expression of a woman conducting an internal inventory and finding certain items missing that she had previously believed herself to possess. "I've been married 22 years, she said. To Arthur. She said his name the way people say names they have grown simultaneously too close to and too far from. I have told myself every year of those 22 years that I made the right choice, that the life I have is the life I chose." A pause. "I said it often enough that I stopped examining whether it was true." Alora waited. "When you came here," Margaret continued, "and you were so visibly in a situation I had decided was beneath notice, it was easy to—" She stopped. "I think I was afraid of what you demonstrated. By existing, what was I demonstrating?" She looked at Alora with something that had cleared away the 22 years of managed surface and was simply underneath it all tired that a woman could choose differently, she said, and that choosing differently didn't have to be ruined. The street went on around them, ordinary and indifferent. "I should have left," Margaret said. The words were quiet and cost something 20 years ago. Before I had built enough of a life inside, the wrong thing to feel like leaving was impossible, but I didn't. And now I've spent years defending something I should have walked away from. And I've spent those years trying to make other women stay inside it, too. She looked at her hands. Because if they stayed, it meant I was right to have stayed. And if they left— "You weren't past choosing," Alora said. Margaret looked at her. "You're not past it now," Alora said. "You're alive. That means the option exists. It always exists until it doesn't." Margaret held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once, small, precise, not agreement exactly, not gratitude, but something genuine, offered and received in the space of a second. Between two women, on the steps of a county office on a spring morning. She went up the steps and into the building. Cord and Alora walked down to their horses. He had been close enough to hear it. He helped her up onto Scout and mounted his own horse, and they rode out of Bitterfield toward the mountain road. "She might not do anything with it," Alora said. "After a while, no," he said. "She might not. But she heard it." "Yes," he said. "She heard it. 3 years after the wedding, on a warm evening at the end of summer, they sat on the porch. As the day came down, the horses were in, the work was done. The mountain to the north had gone from gold to purple and was moving toward black in the slow and unhurried, the way it always did at this hour, ridge after ridge softening, and then darkening, the world going quiet from the top down. She had coffee. He had coffee. "Any regrets?" he asked. He asked it sometimes. She had come to understand that it was not a test and not an expression of doubt. It was the question of a man who had spent a long time being afraid that good things wouldn't last, asking for the evidence that this one had. Well, she thought about it intensely, as she always did. The wedding morning, and the long ride, and the iron bolt on the table. The 6-day storm and the trapline and the fox in the snow. The church and the speech, and Margaret Hollis on the county step. The maps and the route, and his hand turning under hers, not "One," she said. "Good," he said quietly. "You?" "Not even a little." They watched the last light leave the ridge. "I've been thinking about the north section," she said. "The traverse above the second crossing. I think we can improve the footing before freeze. I've been thinking the same. We'll need a day up there before the season closes." "Thursday," he said. "Weather holds through. Thursday, Thursday," she agreed. The dark came in fully. Stars appeared, not scattered, but the entire inventory of them, all at once, the way they appear at this altitude on clear nights, dense and bright and past counting. She had spent her whole life looking at this sky from the valley and had not known. It looked like this. From up here she thought about the girl on the wedding morning, the one in the ruined dress who had climbed up onto a working wagon and refused the offered hand and set her jaw against whatever was coming. Because there was nothing else to do. There was nothing she could have told that girl that would have made the fear smaller, or the first night shorter, or the cold of October more manageable. Some things have to be walked through to be understood. Some winters have to be survived before you know that you can survive them. Some silences have to be inhabited for months before they become the right kind of quiet. She looked at the stars. She was home, not because she had been placed here, not because the options were limited, not because she had endured long enough to stop noticing, because one cold spring morning she had woken up on this mountain and understood that she had stopped living in her mind, that the daily act of staying had shifted from something she was doing to something she was choosing. And the difference between those two things was the entire distance between a cage and a life. She was choosing. She kept choosing every morning, without ceremony, without announcement, in the daily accumulation of small decisions that added up over time to the only thing worth having, which was a life that was entirely, completely, irrevocably hers. They said Cord Halloran bought himself a wife. Here is what they got right. He paid a debt. He married a girl he didn't know. He took her up a mountain road, and she didn't come back down the same person who went up. Here is what they got wrong. Everything else. He didn't buy her. He gave her a lock on a door. He gave her time and space and honesty and a piece of land with both their names on it. He gave her room to become someone she didn't know she was. She gave him back the same. The pack route they built ran for 30 years. The name on the deed, on the contracts, on every piece of paper that came out of that operation. Wren and Hale, both names, in that order. People who didn't know the story sometimes asked why her name came first. She always said the same thing, because she got there first. She arrived on that mountain before any of the rest of it made sense. She was learning it before she knew what she was learning it. For, they said, she cried the whole way up the mountain. She didn't. She was quiet and afraid and watching everything she could see, storing it away, adding it to the inventory of what she knew and what she would need. She was already learning the mountain before she arrived. That is who she was. That is who she became. That is who she had always been, waiting for the right altitude to find out. And Cord Halloran, the man the town had decided was barely better than the animals he ran. He saw it before she did. Didn't name it, didn't shape it, didn't try to hold it. He just gave her a room with a lock on the door and waited to see what she'd do. She did everything. Now you know.